Over the 7 years, there's many aspects of Jacob Bayley's life that we've uncovered that, you know, as I'm sitting here listening to other people speak today and seeing the great crowd here and the number of people that stood up as Bayley descendants, you people have a sense of who Jacob Bayley was. You know Jacob Bayley, you know of him, but outside of the Newbury area, as you get to Vermont and further from Vermont, Jacob Bayley has kind of been a figure that has fallen through the cracks of history. And I guess fortunately for me that has happened because I've worked on this project for 7.5 years and had the fortune of being able to uncover many important aspects of him. Historians are generally lazy, and because there has not been a Bayley collection, Jacob Bayley has kind of fallen through the cracks of history. And it's pretty amazing because in all accounts of books that are written on history, Jacob Bayley is mentioned in maybe a sentence or a paragraph, but there is nothing complete about him. And one reason why is because Jacob Bayley was such a patriot to the cause of American independence that the British viewed him as such a threat, they created an elaborate scheme to come to Newbury to kidnap him. Well, most of you may know the story. I'm not going to get into that. It's in Wells history, and that's one of the pretty well documented aspects of Jacob Bayley's life. But what happened was they never captured him, but they did invade his home, and they took his papers and burned them. So the collection that was the Jacob Bayley papers were destroyed by the British. And I guess in a way the British did affect Jacob Bayley. They didn't capture him that day, but they lost him in history. And certainly Jacob Bayley, without question, what we've learned, has been a minor player on the major scene of the American Revolution and in the founding of 3 states, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York, and really in helping lay a foundation to found our country. And Jacob Bayley was well known through other historical figures in his day. He had several correspondence that I found with General Washington in the Washington papers, in a letter that he wrote in 1803 to Thomas Jefferson, offering his services to him at the age of 77. And think about that. When Thomas Jefferson became president, Jacob Bayley was 77 years old, and he wrote him a letter and said, "I'd like to offer my services to anything that I can do for you in the country. I will be there to help." He is found in the papers of Samuel Adams, Alexander Hamilton, George Clinton, the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, the Marquis de Lafayette, William Heath, Horatio Gates. I could go on and on. He has extensive conversation with these figures that we consider the major players of the Revolution. And one of the more interesting things that I found in the National Archives, there was a letter written in French by one of the men who was one of Jacob Bayley's spies that was coming in and out of Canada. And he was seeking relief, financial relief, by the Continental Congress to help him get back to Quebec. And he wrote a letter to John Hancock, who at that time was the president of the Congress, and he said to him, if you'll remember, Mr. Hancock, the evening that Jacob Bayley brought me to your home in Boston, and the 3 of us had dinner together, and we discussed that you would help me. So think about that. Jacob Bayley from here in Newbury is having dinner, not just on one occasion, but on several occasions with John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress. It's pretty amazing.
Are my home, they belong to me, and to all of her sons and daughters, may they be strong and forever free.
It's interesting that Jacob Bayley really had a sense of the military command and military presence, and although he had this direct line of communication with George Washington, the only time Jacob Bayley actually took an active military command during battle was in the year 1777. And in 1777, there are no letters to or from George Washington and Jacob Bayley, because at that time Jacob Bayley fell under the command of Horatio Gates, and in his view of service would have never gone around Horatio Gates to contact George Washington. Yet in every other year of the Revolution, there are several correspondence between George Washington and Jacob Bayley. And certainly he had a clear sense of duty and a keen sense of military knowledge. And with that, I would mention that the first correspondence that Jacob Bayley had with George Washington was a letter that his brother-in-law, Moses Little, had delivered to George Washington on August 24th of 1775. And in that letter, Jacob Bayley gives George Washington a brief synopsis of what he believes is important as we enter this war with the British that became the Revolution. And amazingly, he describes in this letter what later has become known as the British Anaconda Plan, which was the British military's plan or strategy of how they were going to stop the rebellion. And that is that Jacob Bayley warned Washington to be careful of the British coming down from Canada, down Lake Champlain, down the Hudson River to New York City, and cutting off the northern colonies, the New England colonies, from the southern colonies, similar to what an anaconda would do as it smothers its prey. It's pretty keen stuff. In fact, in that letter, Jacob Bayley talks about what would happen if we set up for American independence. This was 10 months before we actually set up for independence and got those 13 colonies to agree on the Declaration of Independence. And then, interestingly, the last letter that I found that we know of to date in Jacob Bayley's life was a letter that he wrote in the summer of 1811 to Senator Stephen Roe Bradley of Vermont. And in that letter, he discusses with the senator how important it is to have a very, the best offense in military strategy is to have a very strong defense, to be militarily ready for any potential invasion. And this was a year before the War of 1812 broke out. So Bayley certainly had a very keen sense of the military knowledge and military strategy of his day.
While Lord Christ, 1,763 and the third year of our reign. This document is signed by T. Vice of the Council, signed by T. Atkinson, and it is attested by Atkinson.
Part of the aspect of the Bailey-Hazen Road was it was a means to help secure the Continental Army to reinforce the troops that were already in Canada, known as the First Invasion of Canada. And Jacob Bayley was a very ardent proponent of making Canada what he called the 14th colony, because he considered what was Vermont as part of New Hampshire and New York, not really a separate state at that time. So during 1778 and 1779, there was a reignition of the possibility of an invasion of Canada, and it was the second invasion of Canada that would have occurred. In fact, what I've learned in the research that I've done is if that invasion would have happened, the history of your community would have been changed significantly, because that invasion would have taken place, the headquarters for that invasion would have taken place at Jacob Bayley's house. In many of the documents that I've uncovered through pension records of soldiers that were here during the Revolutionary War, Absalom Peters, who was a graduate, one of the early graduates of Dartmouth College, had come to Newbury as an aide to General Bayley. Daniel Hill, who was from Connecticut, had come up here and joined the forces up here. And they talk at length about the fort that was here when they got here, that was built around Jacob Bayley's house, and the military stores that were here to supply the grain, the other foods necessary to feed the cattle, to launch an invasion. And you know, it's interesting because most of us recognize the military heroism or the players in military battles in that those are the people that are out actually fighting in the front lines. But Jacob Bayley was one of those people that was behind the scenes. He was doing all the non-sexy stuff. He was making sure that everybody was prepared, that the defenses were ready. In fact, probably one of the best quotes that I found was written in A History of Vermont by Charles Minor Thompson. And he said that the best thing that sums up Jacob Bayley's life is that Bayley did more for the cause of the founding than waging war. He prevented it. And when Bayley was at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, the one, as I mentioned, the one time he actually took a field command, the British were ready to retreat, and Burgoyne had sent his scouts out to determine what would be the best route that they could return to Canada and retreat. And the scouts came back and they said that they thought that it was virtually impossible to be able to make a retreat because there was a general that was dug in on the east side of the Hudson River at Fort Edward, and there was no way that they would be able to get past them. And that general was Jacob Bayley. Again, he gets one sentence in any history that's written about Saratoga, but that sentence is that he was the general on that side of the Hudson River. And so then Burgoyne had a conference with his generals and decided to surrender, which changed the whole concept of the American Revolution. So those are the kind of things that Jacob Bayley did behind the scenes, as Charles Minor Thompson said, to prevent war. So in 1778, they decide that they're going to think about a reinvasion of Canada, and George Washington appoints his most trusted officer, his most trusted aide at that time, who was the Marquis de Lafayette, to come to Newbury and work with Jacob Bayley and Moses Hazen, who had a Continental Commission at the time, to begin to set the plans in motion for that second invasion. In fact, Ephraim Willard, who was an engineer, was actually put in place to build that fort that I had mentioned to you. And when he came to Newbury, he was told, go to Jacob Bayley and find out what his plans are, and you follow through with them. And so I've been able to find in the Horatio Gates papers that are at the New York Historical Society, actually those plans. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you wouldn't understand, but it is understandable why historians have missed it, because it says, as per J.B. Newbury.
Fly swift around ye
Fly
wheels
swift
of time,
around ye wheels of time,
fly
ye
swift
wheels of time,
and
bring the promised day.
Fly swift around ye
Fly
wheels
swift
of
around
time,
ye wheels of time, ye wheels of time, and bring.
Jacob Bayley wasn't the only person who was helping to get things ready. Colonel Thomas Johnson here in Newbury, and Bailey's very close associate in Haverhill, Timothy Bedell, and also Colonel Robert Johnston over in Haverhill. They had stores and a fort built around their house as well. So it's not just about Jacob Bayley, it's about these two communities together protecting the northern frontier and preparing for a second invasion of Canada. And in late 1778, George Washington put a committee of 3 people together to determine what the military strategy and plan would be to carry out this invasion. The 3 people that were put together on that committee was General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, Jacob Bayley, and Moses Hazen. So throughout late 1778 and early 1779, there is many correspondence back and forth between all of these players preparing for that second invasion. But then late 1778, something happens that changes all of that, and although Horatio Gates was not directly involved in it, there was a movement by another general by the name of Thomas Conway, which has become known as the Conway Cabal, and that is that Conway made an effort to try and unseat Washington as the commander-in-general of the armed forces and to have him replaced with Horatio Gates. So even though Gates was not directly involved in this, there began a mistrust by some of the other aides around Washington of Horatio Gates, and they decided to delay pursuing the second invasion. Then by the spring of 1779, Moses Hazen is sent here to take the road another 26 miles further north to what we know today as Hazen's Notch in Westfield, Vermont. And after that, what really happens in history is this aspect of the campaign really became a diversion to then what George Washington did, and that is to turn to the south to concentrate the forces. So in all of those happenings, Newbury and Jacob Bayley once again kind of missed their history because this really became a diversion. But perhaps most importantly is in all of these things that are happening here and the leadership role that Jacob Bayley had and the responsibility that he had with his community, how did Jacob Bayley view himself? And we've been able to find that in a letter that he had written to the Continental Congress, he believed that he had the sole responsibility of being the leader, of being the guardian of the northern frontier of 200 miles of frontier. And he was the Newbury at that time was the last settled area before you got to the frontier. And Jacob Bayley viewed the responsibility that he had to be the guardian of that frontier. A tremendous responsibility, a tremendous weight that he put on his own shoulders. But throughout all of this, and through the ups and downs in Bayley's life, and as I said, we've found so many other aspects of Bayley's life that have become such an interesting part of the book that we're going to be putting together. And I'm fortunate to be able to work with a gentleman in New York by the name of Mr. Jeffrey Simpson, to begin to put together a complete biography of Bayley, what really occurs in all of this, all of these aspects of Bayley's life, is there was a letter that we found in the National Archives of Canada, written by Captain Matthews, sent back to General Haldeman, who was the person who set the plan in motion to kidnap Jacob Bayley. And he said, you know, we know that the cause of these rebels is hopeless. But you know, we can't get Jacob Bayley to even talk to us. We can't get him to think about coming over to our side. He will be the last person standing next to George Washington. And really in all of that, what rings true is that Jacob Bayley in his life was an unwavering patriot for the American cause in the Revolution, for his community in Newbury and Haverhill, for the counties that he helped found here, for the states of New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York, which he helped found. And he was an unwavering patriot for the American cause in helping found the United States that we enjoy today.